The heavy glass door of the 24-hour convenience store was still swinging when the air turned cold, and it wasn't just the Montana winter pouring in. I saw the kid behind the counter, maybe 19, eyes wide and shimmering with a terror that felt like a physical weight, while a man in a grease-stained hoodie leaned so far over the laminate that his breath was likely fogging the kid's glasses. "Open it," the man hissed, his hand shoved deep into a pocket that sagged with the unmistakable heavy silhouette of a snub-nose. Two others stood by the coffee machines, blocking the path to the door, their eyes darting toward my rig, idling under the sodium lights outside. I didn't say a word, didn't reach for my phone. I just felt the old, familiar hum of adrenaline start to vibrate in my chest, the kind that doesn't ask for permission before it takes over. Before we continue, let us know where you're tuning in from. Drop your city and mile marker in the comments. You're watching Highway Stories Untold, and we love seeing how far these stories travel. The haul had been a long one, 1,800 miles of asphalt and bad radio stations, and my bones felt every single one of them. I'd pulled my Peterbilt into that Sunoco off I-90, just looking for a thermos of black coffee and maybe a sleeve of powdered donuts to get me through the last leg to Missoula. The wind was howling off the peaks, a bitter, biting thing that rattled the mud flaps and made the trailer groan like a living beast. Inside the cab, the dashboard glow was the only world I cared about, but my stomach had other ideas. I climbed down, my boots crunching on the black ice that coated the lot, and made for the neon open sign that flickered like a dying heartbeat. I'm a man who likes his own company and minds his own business. I've spent 20 years on the road, and a few before that in boots that saw a lot worse than a Montana stick-up, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that you don't go looking for trouble. But sometimes, trouble has a way of finding the one person who isn't afraid to look it back in the eye. The moment the bell chimed over the door, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't just the sight of the hooded man at the counter. It was the smell, the metallic tang of fear, and the sour stench of three men who hadn't bathed in a week and had nothing left to lose. The kid behind the register, Leo, was a string bean of a boy with a name tag pinned crooked and a face that still had the soft lines of childhood. He was shaking so hard the plexiglass shield was rattling against its mounting bolts. The leader, the one at the counter, turned his head just enough to see me. He was young, maybe mid-20s, with a jagged scar running through his eyebrow and a look of pure, unearned arrogance. "Keep walking, old man," he spat, his voice cracking just a hair. "This ain't your stop. Get back in your toy truck and roll." I didn't move. I stood by the rack of motor oil, my hands hanging loose at my sides, feeling the weight of the air. I wasn't looking at the leader. I was looking at the kid. "He's just a kid," I said, my voice coming out low like the idle of a cat engine. "And that register doesn't have enough in it to buy you a decent set of tires. Why don't you three just walk out now and we'll call it a bad night?" The two by the coffee machines laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that echoed off the fluorescent-lit aisles. One of them, a tall, wiry guy with a neck tattoo and eyes that looked like they were vibrating from too much meth, stepped forward. He scuffed his boots on the linoleum, a predator testing the fence. "You hear this guy? He thinks he's a hero." He reached out, his hand moving fast, and shoved me hard in the shoulder, trying to knock me back into a display of windshield wiper fluid. But I've spent my life bracing against shifting loads and mountain winds. I didn't budge. I just leaned into the force, absorbing it into my frame, and stepped into his space before he could pull his hand back. "Don't do that again," I whispered. The leader at the counter growled. "Enough of this." He didn't look at the register anymore. He looked at me, realizing I was a variable he hadn't accounted for. He saw the grey in my beard and the worn denim of my jacket and decided I was an easy target. He pulled his hand out of his pocket. It wasn't a gun. It was a heavy, brass-knuckled fist. He swung, a wild amateur haymaker aimed right for my jaw. The world slowed down. It's a side effect of the past, the way time stretches when things go kinetic. I slipped the punch, the air of it whistling past my ear, and drove my palm into his solar plexus. The air left him in a wet wheeze. As he buckled, the tall one with the neck tattoo lunged, trying to wrap his arms around my waist to take me to the floor. I dropped my center of gravity, caught his head in a front headlock, and pivoted my hips. The momentum sent him face first into the metal edge of the soda cooler. The glass didn't break, but the sound of his forehead hitting the frame was like a hammer on an anvil. I pushed the leader back toward the coffee station, keeping my eyes on the third man who had stayed back until now. This one was the smartest of the bunch. He'd pulled a folding knife with a jagged blade. He wasn't rushing in. He was circling, looking for an opening while his buddy groveled on the floor. The leader was coughing, trying to find his breath, while the tall one was slumped against the Gatorade, blood starting to leak from a cut on his hairline. "You're making a big mistake, trucker," the one with the knife said, his voice a low hiss. He flipped the blade, catching the harsh overhead light. "You should have stayed in the cab." "I get that a lot," I said. I reached back and grabbed a heavy glass pot of decaf off the burner. It was steaming, nearly boiling. I didn't throw it. I held it like a mace. "But I'm already out now, and I don't like people who bully kids." The knife wielder lunged, a straight thrust aimed for my gut. I swiped the coffee pot across, the heavy glass catching his wrist with a sickening crack. The knife clattered to the floor. Before he could scream, I doused his chest with the hot liquid. He recoiled, shrieking, and I stepped in, delivering a short, brutal hook to his liver that folded him like a lawn chair. I turned back to the leader. He was on his feet now, his face purple with rage. He wasn't thinking about money anymore. He was thinking about the fact that an old man had just dismantled his crew in less than 60 seconds. He reached behind his back, and this time I knew it wasn't a bluff. The steel of a compact 9mm cleared his waistband. "I'll kill you!" he screamed, his hands shaking as he tried to chamber around. I didn't have a weapon, and I was 10 feet away. The kid behind the counter screamed, a raw, piercing sound that cut through the hum of the refrigerators. I looked at the mirror behind the counter, the wide-angle security mirror, and saw something he didn't. I saw the headlights of a second rig pulling into the lot, the high beams cutting through the store's front windows, blinding him for a split second. "Look at the glass," I said, my voice steady, showing no fear. "You really think I'm here alone?" He flinched, glancing toward the window as the air horns of a freightliner shook the very foundation of the building. In that split second of hesitation, I didn't run for cover. I charged. I tackled him across the counter, our bodies crashing into the cigarette racks and sending hundreds of boxes flying like plastic rain. We hit the floor hard, the gun skittering away under the lottery machine. He clawed at my face, his fingernails digging into my cheek, but I had the dominant position. I pinned his wrists with my knees and delivered 2 precise, controlled strikes to the side of his neck. His eyes rolled back, and the fight left him. I stayed there for a moment, chest heaving, the smell of burnt coffee and sweat filling my nose. My knuckles were raw, and my shoulder was screaming from the tackle, but the store had gone quiet, dead quiet. I looked up at Leo. The kid was still behind the counter, clutching a phone, his knuckles white as bone. "Call them," I said, breathing hard. "Tell them it's over." I stood up, adjusting my jacket, feeling every one of my 50 years. My hand was shaking just a little, the adrenaline beginning its long, slow retreat. I looked out the window. The freightliner wasn't a cop. It was Big Jim, a guy I'd shared a load board with for years, his chrome grille gleaming in the dark. He'd seen the commotion through the glass and done the only thing a brother of the road knows how to do. He'd made himself seen. The tall one was groaning, trying to crawl toward the door on his stomach. I stepped on the tail of his hoodie, not hard enough to choke him, just enough to let him know he wasn't going anywhere. "Stay put," I said, my voice echoing in the small space. "You've got a long night ahead of you." The silence that followed the roar of Big Jim's air horn was heavy, thick with the smell of spilled decaf and the ozone of a discharged stun gun one of them must have dropped. I stood there in the center of the aisle, my chest heaving, watching the steam rise from the chest of the man I'd doused with coffee. He was moaning, a low, pathetic sound that didn't match the arrogance he'd walked in with. Leo, the kid behind the counter, finally lowered the phone, his hands still trembling so violently I thought he might drop it. "They're coming," Leo whispered, his voice cracking like dry timber. "The sheriff's deputies. They said 10 minutes. 10 minutes is an eternity on a lonely stretch of Montana highway." I looked out the window. Big Jim was climbing down from his cab, his silhouette massive against the glare of his high beams. But as he stepped onto the pavement, I saw something in the side view mirror of my Peterbilt, a dark SUV pulling fast into the shadows behind the diesel pumps. "Leo, get under the counter," I snapped, my voice dropping back into that low command tone. "And stay there until I tell you otherwise." The leader I'd tackled was starting to stir. I didn't give him the chance to find his feet. I grabbed him by the scruff of his hoodie and hauled him upright, slamming him back against the cigarette rack. "Who's in the SUV?" I demanded. He just grinned, a bloody, jagged expression. "You think we're the only ones? We were just the scouts, old man. You should have minded your own business." I didn't argue. I reached down, grabbed the 9mm he'd dropped, and cleared the chamber, pocketing the magazine and tossing the frame behind the counter where he couldn't reach it. I could feel the cold seeping through the door again. The SUV's doors opened in unison. 3 more men stepped out, and these weren't twitchy meth heads. They moved with a synchronized, deliberate pace that told me I'd just stepped into something much larger than a convenience store robbery. I stepped out of the store before they could reach the door. I didn't want the kid caught in the crossfire of whatever was coming next. The wind whipped my hair across my face, stinging like needles. Big Jim was halfway across the lot, stopping dead when he saw the new arrivals. "Jim, get back to the rig!" I yelled over the wind. The men from the SUV didn't stop. The one in the lead, wearing a tactical jacket and a headset, leveled a gaze at me that was cold enough to freeze diesel. "Move aside, driver. We're here for the boy and the bag he's holding." "The boy is 19 and scared to death," I said, stepping into the space between them and the door, my boots finding purchase on the grit-covered ice. "And as for the bag, the only thing in there is a few rolls of quarters and a bad attitude. You're not going inside." The lead man didn't waste time with threats. He signaled to the 2 behind him. They split up, flanking me. I felt the familiar tightening in my gut, the strategic shift. This wasn't a brawl anymore. It was an extraction. The first one lunged, aiming a collapsible baton at my ribs. I moved with the blow, catching his forearm and using his own momentum to drive my elbow into the bridge of his nose. I heard the bone snap, a dry, sickening pop. But the second one was already on me, his heavy boot catching me in the thigh and sending a jolt of white-hot pain up my spine. I stumbled, my knee hitting the frozen pavement. "Jack!" Jim's voice boomed. I heard the hiss of air brakes. Jim wasn't getting back in his rig. He was pulling a tire iron from his side box. The man with the baton was back on his feet, blood masking his face, his eyes filled with a professional, calculated rage. He didn't scream, he just reset his stance. I forced myself up, the pain in my leg a dull roar now, and centered my weight. I looked at the lead man who was still standing by the SUV, watching me like I was an interesting bug he was about to crush. "You're a long way from home, soldier," I said, recognizing the way he stood, the way he measured the distance. "And you're a long way from a hospital," he replied. I saw his hand move toward his holster. I didn't wait. I lunged toward the man with the baton, catching him off guard with a low-line kick to the kneecap that sent him screaming to the ice. I grabbed the baton as it fell, spinning it in a tight arc to catch the second attacker across the temple. He went down hard, his head bouncing off the concrete. But the lead man was faster. I heard the distinct click of a holster strap being thumbed open. I was out of time, out of options, and standing in the middle of a spotlighted parking lot like a target on a range. Then the lot went dead quiet. The sound started as a low rumble, something you feel in your teeth before you hear it in your ears. From the dark entrance of the truck stop, 3 sets of headlights appeared, then 5, then 10. The massive chrome-heavy grills of 5 long haulers began to circle the lot, their engines roaring in a synchronized mechanical anger. The man from the SUV froze, his hand still on his sidearm. He looked around as the trucks formed a literal wall of steel around us, their high beams creating a blinding white arena. "You picked the wrong stop tonight," I said, wiping a smear of blood from my lip and looking him dead in the eye. The lead man from the SUV stood paralyzed in the crosshairs of a dozen high beams, his professional mask finally cracking as the ground beneath his tactical boots vibrated with the collective roar of 30,000 pounds of American steel. The Brotherhood didn't say a word. They didn't have to. The sheer mass of the rigs, idling in a tight, impenetrable semicircle, turned the parking lot into a cage. Big Jim stood by my side, the tire iron gripped in a hand the size of a Christmas ham, his eyes locked on the 2 men I'd managed to put on the ground. "Check the boy," I grunted to Jim, my voice rasping from the exertion. My leg was throbbing where the kick had landed, a deep, bone-bruised ache that made every shift of my weight a gamble, but I couldn't let my guard down yet. The leader of the SUV crew slowly raised his hands, though he didn't look defeated. He looked like he was calculating the cost of a gunfight he knew he couldn't win. "You're interfering with a high-value recovery, Mercer," he said, his voice cold and knowing. My heart skipped a beat at the sound of my name. He wasn't just a random thug. He had a dossier. "I'm just a guy getting coffee," I replied, stepping forward until I was just outside his reaching distance. "And you're just a guy about to be explaining a lot of broken glass to the county sheriff." Suddenly, the side door of the SUV flew open. A 4th man, one I hadn't seen, lunged out with a submachine gun leveled at the line of trucks. The professional calm evaporated into pure kinetic chaos. I didn't think. I acted on a decade of muscle memory. I dived at the leader, shoulder-checking him into the side of his own vehicle to use it as cover, while the first rounds of fire shattered the neon Sunoco sign above us in a spray of humming gas and glass. "Jim, get down!" I bellowed. I felt the leader's ribs give slightly under my weight as we hit the SUV's door panel. He was fast, reaching for a backup piece in an ankle holster, but I grabbed his head and slammed it against the doorframe, the metal-on-bone thud echoing through the lot. I didn't stop there. I rolled him over, pinning his arm behind his back until the joint groaned, and used his body as a shield while his partner in the SUV sprayed lead toward the radiator of Big Jim's rig. The Brotherhood responded in the only way truckers know how. Instead of backing off, they surged. 2 of the rigs, massive Kenworths with heavy brush guards, lurched forward, their tires screaming as they crushed the front and rear of the SUV, pinning it in a mechanical vise. The shooter inside was thrown against the dashboard, his weapon clattering out the window and onto the ice. I hauled the leader up by his collar, dragging him toward the center of the lot, where the light was brightest. My knuckles were split, and my face was a mask of sweat and Montana grit, but the rage in my chest was a cold, hard diamond. "Who sent you?" I hissed, twisting his arm just enough to make him hiss through his teeth. "And why are you hunting a 19-year-old Clerk?" He spat blood at my boots, a defiant, ugly grin spreading across his face. "The kid isn't a Clerk, Mercer. Look at his ink. Look at what he's been hiding under that long-sleeve shirt." I looked back toward the store. Leo had emerged from behind the counter, prompted by the silence of the jammed SUV. He was standing in the doorway, the harsh fluorescent light hitting his arms. He'd pushed up his sleeves to wipe the sweat from his face, and there it was. A series of numbered tattoos on his inner forearms, the kind used by human trafficking syndicates to track inventory. The kid wasn't just a victim. He was a witness who had escaped. And these men were the cleaners sent to bring him back to the dark. "He's coming with us," the leader choked out, even as I increased the pressure on his arm. "One way or another, the boss gets what's his." I looked at the line of truckers who had climbed down from their cabs, a wall of denim and flannel standing in the shadows of their chrome. They didn't need to be told what was happening. They saw the tattoos, saw the fear in the boy's eyes, and they moved as one. "Not tonight," I said, my voice carrying over the idling engines. "Tonight he's with the Brotherhood." I shoved the leader toward the ground, where Big Jim was waiting with a set of heavy-duty zip ties he kept for securing loads. We had them contained, but the distant sound of a second set of sirens, not the local sheriff, but something faster, heavier, began to wail from the east. The boss wasn't far behind, and this truck stop was about to become a battlefield. I walked over to Leo, who was staring at the crumpled SUV like it was a ghost. I put a hand on his shoulder, feeling the frantic bird-like racing of his heart. "Get your things, kid," I said quietly. "You're riding with me. We're going to a place where they can't find you." "But the cops," he started, his eyes darting toward the horizon. "The cops in this county don't have enough backup for what's coming," I told him, looking at the line of rigs. "But we do." The sirens to the east weren't coming from the local law. They were coming from a blacked-out motorcade that didn't care about jurisdictions. I could feel the irreversible change in the air, the moment where walking away was no longer an option. I looked at Leo, seeing the numbers on his arm, and I knew if he stayed here, he was a dead man. I grabbed my heavy maglite and signaled to the Brotherhood. "Jim, lead the way out. We're forming a rolling block," I barked. I hauled Leo into the passenger seat of my Peterbilt, the cabin smelling of old leather and diesel, a sanctuary of steel. As I slammed the door, the first of the pursuer's vehicles skidded into the lot, trying to cut us off before we hit the on-ramp. I didn't hesitate. I threw the shifter into gear and let the torque of the cat engine roar, the massive grill of my rig acting as a battering ram against a sedan that tried to block my path. The sound of crunching fiberglass and snapping plastic was a visceral reminder that the stakes had shifted from a store brawl to a vehicular war. The chase was high intensity, a kinetic pursuit under the shadows of the Montana peaks. 2 SUVs swerved around me, trying to box me in, their tires throwing up plumes of slush and gravel. I watched the mirrors, waiting for the moment they committed. When the lead vehicle tried to pit maneuver my trailer, I flicked the steering wheel, letting the back end of the 53-footer swing out just enough to catch their fender. They spun out, a chaotic mess of metal rolling into the ditch. "They're still coming, Jack!" Leo yelled, pointing at the headlights gaining on us from behind. "Let them," I muttered, my hands steady on the wheel. I knew what they didn't. Up ahead, the Brotherhood was waiting. We hit the narrow bridge over the Blackfoot River, and that's when the trap snapped shut. 3 rigs pulled across the lanes, their headlights forming a blinding wall of white light. The pursuers slammed on their brakes, trapped between my rolling mass and the stationary wall of the Brotherhood. I brought the Peterbilt to a hissing stop and climbed down, the wind whipping my jacket as I walked toward the lead SUV. The driver stepped out, reaching for a sidearm, but he stopped when he saw the 40 truckers stepping out of their cabs behind me, tire irons and heavy flashlights in hand. "You're out of road," I said, my voice quiet but firm. I pulled out my phone and held it up, the screen glowing with the playback of my dashcam, a silent witness that had recorded every second of their assault, their faces and their plates. "I've been streaming this to a secure server since the truck stop. Every federal agency in 3 states has your location and your faces." The man's face went pale as he realized the tactical situation had flipped. The authority of the dashcam receipts, combined with the physical presence of the Brotherhood, broke their resolve. As the real sirens finally began to wail in the distance, the sound of actual justice approaching, the cleaners dropped their weapons and knelt on the asphalt. I stood there, a middle-aged trucker with raw knuckles and a tired heart, knowing that for one night the road had belonged to the righteous. The flashing blue and red lights finally began to paint the snow-covered pines as the state troopers took custody of the men on the bridge. I stood by the grill of my Peterbilt, the engine ticking as it cooled in the mountain air, watching Leo talk to a soft-spoken deputy. The kid looked smaller now that the adrenaline had bled out of him, but his shoulders weren't hunched anymore. I walked over to him, reaching into my cab to grab my old flannel-lined jacket, the one that had seen me through a dozen winters. I draped it over his shoulders, and for the first time that night the ghost of a smile touched his face. "You're going to be okay, Leo," I said, my voice rough from the cold. "There are people who know how to handle the rest of this. You're not a number anymore." He looked at the tattoo on his arm, then back at the wall of trucks that had stood by him. "Why did you do it?" he asked quietly. "You don't even know me." I looked out at the long, dark stretch of the I-90, the road that never seems to end. "Because someone had to," I replied, keeping it simple. I climbed back into the driver's seat, the familiar weight of the world settling back onto my shoulders. I didn't wait for a thank you or a handshake. I checked my mirrors, saw the Brotherhood beginning to disperse back into the night, and pulled my rig back onto the asphalt. As I shifted through the gears, the cabin went quiet, save for the hum of the road and the steady beat of a heart that had seen too much, but still knew right from wrong. I had a schedule to keep and a load to deliver. Behind me, the bridge faded into the darkness, but in the rear view, I could see Leo still wearing my jacket, standing tall under the Montana stars. Thank you for watching, and if stories like this one about courage, sacrifice, and second chances speak to you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more incredible, true stories that honor the forgotten heroes among us.